time for a review, I felt. I've just read a book by Adam Roberts, Land of the Headless, which is behind me there. And I thought really it was time to maybe discuss some of Adam's early work. And I'll do it in form of going through the first 6 or 7 books and then talk about Land of the Headless specifically. Now, Adam is Professor of Literature, 19th century literature, at Royal Holloway University. He's a fellow of the Royal Society of Literature. Not many SF writers are. And since about 2000, he's produced a SF novel every year. He's also written lots of parodies, pastiches, and he's written a mainstream historical novel. His most recent novel, which I've not read, is arguably a crime novel. And he is, for my money, one of the most intelligent and entertaining pure SF writers left in Britain. And recently, John at Sci-Fi Scavenger, hi John, reviewed Stone, his third novel, on his channel, so do check that out. And John described Roberts as quaint because he specialises in singletons. There's only one series, it only has 2 episodes so far, and that's the Real Town Murders series, and there's been no sign of a third, and I suspect that Adam was pushed towards that by Golax. But he is basically your proper SF novelist who invents the wheel every time and takes us through that classic structure of novum, paradigm shift, cognitive dissonance and conceptual breakthrough. It may seem like a formula, but it is at the heart of most great SF novels. And this is one of the reasons why I love Adam. He doesn't rely on the easy commercial comfort of a series. He likes to explore, and he's a proper literary chap, but he's also an entertainer as well. So quaint is an interesting word because one of the meanings of quaint is, of course, old-fashioned, but Roberts is anything but old-fashioned. Land of the Headless is, in fact, full of the influences and inspirations of the more important modern writers whose shadows cast over the more aspirational science fiction scribes still out there. And while it is those who overly rely on series sequences who are kowtowing to the lowest common denominator, the latest trend of routine escapism and the comfortable sameness the publishers find commercially acceptable, Adam goes further. Now, series, of course, can go beyond craft into art, but will always owe something to artisanship. There's nothing wrong with this, but ask yourself this question. Did Philip K. Dick write series? Did J.G. Ballard? Did Christoper Priest? Yeah, he wrote the Dream Archipelago, but that's an anti-series. So we're going to have a look at this, and I'll take you through the books which come before it. Land of the Headless is at once a stunning pure genre SF novel with pace, excitement, novel concepts, narrative drive, inventiveness, and a pulse-pounding climax. It's also a reflective and questioning work of modernism. And now here's the conceit. There's a colony planet which is called Plews, like plus with an E on the end, and it's reminiscent of the Middle East. It's sort of dominated by a near totalitarian fundamentalism, and which dictates everything based on its official religion. And the religion seems to fuse Christianity and Islam, and it suggests a future path of synthesis for these 2 great faiths of the book. And the one that's excluded from this is Judaism, which isn't mentioned specifically. Now, I'll be honest and say I don't really know enough about Judaism and its cosmology, etc., to really see whether things I should have noticed. So my apologies if I have, and if anybody has noticed them and read this, please mention in the comments below. So the Bible and Quran have merged. Judaism is not mentioned at all, and neither are Jesus or Muhammad, though the all-God is the God which is mentioned, and it seems to become sort of quite even more monotheistic. There's not much mention of any other sort of beings in a supernatural sort of setting, as it were, like say with Catholicism. And the mention of the all-God is sort of like a conflation, perhaps, of Allah and God. And obviously I know those 2 things are pretty much the same thing, but that's what's implied. So on Plews, there is a form of corporal punishment. Now, corporal, of course, literally means the chastisement of the body, corporeal, the corpse. And the particular form of corporal punishment for certain misdemeanors, shall we say, is beheading. And the sort of decapitation that goes on, however, is one in which the sentence subject isn't actually killed. You're beheaded, but you're not killed. Instead, the consciousness of the criminal is downloaded into a small device, a box, called the ordinator, which is then located at the felon's lower back, at the base of their spine. And once this operation is completed, the recidivist is then painlessly beheaded, and his neck is capped with like a high-tech bottle top, and camera eyes are implanted into the shoulders, either directly in or on stalks. And fundamentally, the headless then have very low-tech vision, like cameras. And Roberts describes this with great facility, and it's really sort of disorienting, because you start to think about this idea of people wandering around with a neck but no heads, and it's quite an image, and it keeps flashing back to you throughout the book. It's a typically surreal and dizzying novum, and it's the kind of thing that Adam really excels at, and he instills in the reader a staggering paradigm shift that makes your head literally swim with cognitive estrangement. A simple story, that's irony, of course, and seeing this subtitle instantly made me think of the eponymous novel by Elizabeth Inchbald, A Simple Story, and that's from the late 18th century, and it was popular into the early 19th century and quite influential. Now, because Adam is a professor of English literature, for the 19th century, he may well have taught Inchbald's work, and it's a sort of classic book that's never out of print. It's not that famous, and it sort of falls chronologically between the great English moralist Samuel Richardson, who wrote Clarissa, which is one of the longest novels in the English language. It's a brick, it's like that, and he is often credited, Colin Wilson credited him with the invention of the sort of modern social novel, which is like a soap opera with lots of character interplay. And Inchbald comes between him and Jane Austen, and Jane Austen was almost undoubtedly influenced by Inchbald as well. And like Land of the Headless, A Simple Story by Inchbald is a book concerned with religion. It's concerned with rape, because that's a big issue in Land of the Headless, and also love, which is a subject that comes up in it as well. And the interesting thing about the society on Plews is that rape has an interesting interpretation or three in this fundamentalist world that they live in. And John seems like a strange mixture. He's this sort of very romantic, poetic type, and sometimes he spills over with religious cant. He has a potential for self-deception, which is sort of typically atypical of the Roberts protagonist. And Roberts' protagonists, they vary enormously. He tends to write in the first person a lot, not always, but you're always aware of distinct individuals. And Gradacell is written in a quite different style to Land of the Headless. And also Polystorm is very different. Those are three books which show the different sort of varieties of character that he's created, and the way that his voice merges with unique characters. So with John Cavallo, we kind of feel for him when he gets beheaded, but at times, I did marvel at his tendency to make assumptions while displaying quite admirable fortitude at times, as his situation does tend to go downhill from his beheading. And after the decapitation, he takes a pilgrimage with two other headless men and a woman called Suzanne, who is headed, who has a sympathetic religious sort of feeling towards us, and she goes with them. And they're going to somewhere called Canaan, and they're heading for the Land of the Headless, because basically people in Plews who are headless are pariahs. Everybody can see they've committed a crime. It's shameful. And, so they really are outsiders, and they get really bad jobs and what have you. So on the way, you get this thing, you think, well, how is this going to work when someone's got no head? And Adam convincingly describes the science of how the headless can function. And this pops up a number of times in the book, especially later on, and you learn more about that. And it's really, really inventive. Now, if you're not familiar with the word Canaan, Canaan, of course, is a place in the Bible, and it's spelt differently in the book, but obviously there's an implication there. So when you read the book, if you don't know your Bible, it's certainly worth looking and having a look and seeing what Canaan means and where it comes up. It comes up many times in the Bible. Something that kept on occurring to me all the time when I was reading this book was I was continually drawn back internally to visualizing headless people walking around the streets. And it's very disorienting, and it's a great marker of how well Adam uses cognitive dissonance and estrangement in the book, because you just keep flashing on this and you think, wow, this would just look so strange because they have necks but not heads. And, you know, it's absolutely brilliant. But John and the society he's in, they've all lost their heads. That's the whole thing. And it implies that the religious fundamentalism and totalitarianism are, to the rationalist Westerner, you know, completely make no sense, and that everybody involved has lost their head, metaphorically, but in this book, literally. And of course, that's the beauty of SF. It, you know, it really sort of talks about the contemporary world through metaphor. And this was absolutely stunning image that kept coming back to me. So John and Suzanne and the two other headless guys are on this pilgrimage, but this gets wrong-footed by another institution, which is totalitarian, another totalitarian agency on Plus, and a situation that's worthy of Franz Kafka, Anna Kavan, or even Ionesco, the absurd dramatist, and probably Philip K. Dick arises. And there's a situation with the police and the interpretation of legalese and religious dogma and how many angels on the head of a pin. And this imposes itself upon John, and his fate becomes different. He ends up as a soldier on an off-world war and the war is with, it's called the Sugar War. And why it's called the Sugar War is interesting as well. I'm not going to go into that. But, you know, Adam just doesn't sort of drop these things in. It's a really, really interesting SF conceit about the sugar, which reminded me of, in a way, of The Great Hydration by Barrington J. Bailey. Plus is at war with a kinder, more secular colony planet, and there are battle scenes, and they're very, very interesting. So it goes from being like The Trial to Full Metal Jacket, and Roberts expertly seeds the plot here with two elements that the reader might see as clues to him possibly delivering a bravura performance of those elements of SF, the novum, the paradigm shift, cognitive estrangement. We've had all those already, and he keeps the strangeness with the image of the headless. And towards the end, you just get the feeling that we're going to get the quantum punch of conceptual breakthrough. But he does wrong-foot us as well with these two things, which is really, really clever. So he teases us with a kind of expectation of a textbook denouement. But is that going to be the case? So are these things clues, or are they red herrings? And I'm still puzzling about one now, and I absolutely love that he sort of wrong-footed me so well, because it's quite difficult to do, because some of the writers are like a big on wrong footing and misdirection, and I really, really enjoyed that. So well done, Adam. And this is where he really shows that the current crop of series fixated writers look lame. Again and again, in book after book, he denies comfort and familiarity and encourages us with a new idea to be dazzled by. And this is what this book did. It dazzled me. Adam comprehends the innate strength of the best SF writers, taking the what if intensely and asking it anew of readers every time. So when you pick up one of his books, it's what if again, like it used to be in the days when people like Silverberg would push out all these different singletons. It was a new thing every time. It was the same thing, but it was a new thing, and you never knew where it would go. And it was a really great competitive thing to see writers retesting themselves with ideas and asking those questions. And it's just so refreshing, and that's why he's the finest genre SF writer in Britain at the moment, in my view. He's the most dedicated to that, to presenting us each time with a new novel concept, putting the bucket of water in your face. And he just writes really beautifully. His prose is very strong. He can be very funny. He can be very serious. And he's easy to read, but he's never dull to read. A lot of today's popular SF writers are dull to read. He's also very clear. You know exactly where you are. There's real sinew and thew in his stories and in his characters. And he has all the virtues of a real novelist, and he understands the whole metaphoric thing so well. So when I think of Land of the Headless, it did make me think of Silverberg a lot because of its spiritual insight, its readability, its sheer creativity. He's less certain than Silverberg in his judgment, I would say, and observations of power, transformation and transcendence, because of course those are very key spiritual themes for Silverberg. And Roberts is a bit more of a hard-headed rationalist, I would say. He's perhaps closer to his characters subjectively than Silverberg, and They are possibly more varied, more modern and less classical, but they're no less worthy of your attention. So as sober as Land of the Headless is, it's a fun read combining performance with a meditative quality, action with perfection. It has world building, it has starship physics, which you'll enjoy if you like that kind of thing. The Higgs boson is implied. It is military SF. Roberts combines classic genre SF tropes with astute political commentary, and the ending was different to what I thought it would be, and I enjoyed it. It's a very human book and a very humane book, and it's a book about change and how we deal with visible shame, and in that respect it was really good. And even though I really felt for John at times, because he starts off and you think, this is a really terrible society, but it does make you look at what he does, and he looks at what he does, and great dialogue and crackling characters, and I must say it took my head off. So Adam published his first novel at the age of 35, and it arrived with quite a splash, and that was Salt. And Salt was marketed quite heavily, very beautiful as the thing you read. It's quite a slim novel, and this is a novel of colonization on a planet called Salt, which is funnily enough covered in salt, and it has a lot of politics in it. It's quite sober and austere. It's very well written. It was very well reviewed. Adam doesn't do a lot of short stories, so it was sort of very anticipated, and it sort of got compared in the jacket flap to Dune. It's not really like Dune. There are some superficial similarities, but obviously they were thinking this is going to be a real classic for the future. So if you like it austere and cool and very well written, I mean, what this reminded me of, this is the sort of thing you'd enjoy if you like people like D.G. Compton, and you probably enjoy it even if you like Kim Stanley Robinson, but this is writing of a higher order. So that's Salt, and that made quite a splash. The following year, Adam produced On, and On is one of those classic world building books where there's a central character who lives on a structure like a wall and has to make his way up and down it to survive, and conditions are quite primitive, and quite a few writers have done this. And the sort of key model for these sort of things really is probably Hothouse by Brian Aldiss, but this is an entertaining ride, doesn't essentially come off in the way that I would have liked. It does have a very interesting ending. Adam's really good at endings. He doesn't always explain them, and he does keep you guessing, but the ride is rather good. But I think at this stage he was still in a journeyman phase, but these are books which are well worth reading. Most of his book is still in print or was easily obtainable second-hand. Then I think he made a big step forward with his third novel, Stone. Now, when John reviewed this, he said he could see the influence of Ian Banks. Now, what I would say is this. It isn't so much the influence, is that there are references, because Adam is somebody who probably wouldn't be influenced by Banks if he would have read him. And really, Stone is the story of a criminal in a future universe which is fairly utopian, and he is in this planetary prison, but he's offered the chance to get away if he does a contract killing, but he has to kill an entire planet, everybody on a certain planet. And it's really, really good. I really enjoyed it. This is probably a good entry point for those of you who like space opera, that sort of thing. And one of my favourite things in there is something that John mentioned as well, which is the means by which people travel into space in this, and it's really, really good, and lots of twists and turns. And I do like things which have a kind of anti-heroic narrator, and in this sense I was reminded of Barrington J. Bailey's Empire of Two Worlds, though this is more literary, but this is a great sort of joining spot if you're a reader who likes space stories and the more conventional end of SF. Nothing wrong with that, of course, you're very welcome to it, but I would say give Stone a try, and I really like it. I mean, something that John said was he didn't like the fact that the narrator is always talking to something or somebody that he calls stone, and it does appear to be an actual piece of rock, and John found that a bit irksome. I actually really like it, and it's kind of a literary device, and you find out eventually what it's all about, but I really recommend Stone. So that's a great entry point. Not that you should pass over the other books, but that would be where I would come in. I must say that's my favourite early one. So a book a year, and the great thing about Adam is he has publicly said that he is going to cover every sort of trope he can think of in the sort of history of genre SF, and he loves it. And he could have a career as a mainstream novelist. He wrote an historical novel based on an unfilmed screenplay by Anthony Burgess a while ago, and it reminded me of Donald Barthelme. He has got the chops, he could do it, you know, but he loves SF. And there's a really good TED talk where he talks about how science fiction is like poetry, and of course he teaches things like poetry, so he really knows his stuff. This is Polystone, and Polystone, interesting title. This is a really quirky book, and I really enjoyed this. And it's basically looking at somebody who lives on like a huge estate in what appears to be the distant future, and it's very ornate. And what it reminded me of was Moorcock's Dances at the End of Time, though it isn't essentially an end of time narrative. There's a lot of Rococo styling and some very, very strange sort of landscapes and personalities involved. And I don't really want to say any more about it than that. And again, it's got a fascinating ending, which reminded me of the ending of On, which is probably its strongest sort of point, really. And what can we say about it? I'm just going to glance at it now, because, yeah, very, very interesting. I loved it. And, yeah, so he does play a lot of games with this. And I remember sitting reading this in a deck chair in my garden a few years ago, thinking, wow, this is great. And for some reason, it reminded me of Michael Coney as well. Probably because I just read, I remember Palahaxi by Michael Coney, another sort of summary feel to it, and very sort of decadent and ornate. Shades of Barrett and J. Bailey, as I say, also in this as well, I would say, in terms of the colour and the florid nature of it. Very, very good. Then the first Roberts I actually read was this one, The Snow, because I will admit, I was kind of put off the kind of hype that surrounded Salt, and I wasn't really reading a lot of SF by then. And by the time this came out, this I think is about 2005. Let's have a look. Let's see. It came out in 2004, so it's a book a year, and this is The Snow, and this is a catastrophe novel, but snow starts falling, and it keeps on falling, and it keeps on falling. And I remember Chris Priest did a review of this, which he said, you know, there's certain failings in the logic here about what's happening. I wasn't too concerned about that myself. This is quite a serious, sober political book, and it has to be said, this is a tough one. So this is a very dark catastrophe novel, and it doesn't have any of the sort of daring do. There is a lot of political stuff. So there's a kind of washback to things like Salt. So as you see, we've got a very varied sort of career. All singletons, no series, none of that messing around. Something that Adam has done a lot of as well. He's done a lot of novellas for PS, and I've got all of them. I've got all his SF books in hardcover first, except the ones which weren't issued in hardcover. There are two of them. There's a short story collection called Adam Robots, which is from later on. And his very finest novel, The Thing itself, was a paperback original, which is kind of shocking, really, because it's just really should have been a hardcover. It's an amazing book, one of the best SF novels I've read in the last 10 years, easily. Currently, because I went through this thing where I went back and I read the early ones, and because I read the Snuffers, and I read all of those in order, and that was a few years back. And I've read other later books by him in a scattershot sort of way of doing things. But I read Land of the Headless recently, but I realised that what I should have read in my sequential reading about him was this book, Gradacel, which I'm reading at the moment. And Gradacel is a mishearing of Yggdrasil, the world tree of Norse mythology. And I'm only a little bit into this. And this is Adam's biggest early book, 400 pages odd. And it's got a first-person narrator, female, and it's about the idea that the way to get into space is not through rocketry, but by using the electromagnetic sphere and inventing planes which can zip up the electromagnetic fields around Earth. And one of them gets called Yggdrasil. And people are living in space in tiny little habitats, and the narrator's a woman. And this is set at the very end of the 21st century, and the woman is looking back over her life. And Gradacil is the name of her daughter. And I'm only about 100 pages in, but I'm really enjoying it. It's not one of my favourites so far, but I will go further into it later on. But because it's planes, that brings me to something else. Something I've just acquired, which, and I know I keep mentioning Christoper Priest, and, you know, okay, he's my favourite author. He's recently died, and he's on my mind a lot. and everything just seems to remind me of him, and his influence has just spread so far, and I'm more aware of it than ever before. And this is a book I acquired very recently from the USA. This is Harrier by Donald Mackenzie in Firecrest. In my recent haul at Bob's, you will have seen the Graham Masterton book in Firecrest, which is super rare. This is uncommon as well, and I only became aware of this in the last few weeks. And Chris wrote 2 of these, and Harrier as by Donald Mackenzie. Now Chris's middle name was Mackenzie, and I got this from the States from Biblio, and there was, I think, a paperback, and there's another one called Thunderbolt, and Chris was also very interested in planes. So this is a sort of Thatcher era, Falklands era thriller set in a Latin American country, which is not a real one. So I'm wondering whether we can count it as SF. It's certainly a techno thriller, and Chris was very interested in flights and flying, and I didn't know about these, and I decided to try and get this. I'm not big on collecting people's pseudonymous work, and I am thinking about this with Christopher Evans and Robert Holdstock at the moment, whether I'm going to go down that rabbit hole. But it's very beautiful. It's a lovely library book, and I do love these, as I say, and I'm interested to read it because I have read Chris's better known hack work, which are the 2 books he wrote under the name John Luther Novak, which are both film tie-ins for Mona Lisa and David Cronenberg's Existence. And by the time Existence was out, everybody knew it was him. He also wrote the tie-in for Short Circuit 2, under the name Colin Wedgelock. Fantastic name. Sounds just like an SF writer. So that is about planes. So I'm quite interested to read that, and I'm going to go on to that next. And yeah, I'm very fond of these library books. I do like these sort of very plain things. They do take me back. Sad old man being nostalgic, I know. This is Outlaw Bookseller signing out for now. There'll be more Adam Roberts coming on the channel, so if you haven't read him before, a great place to start is probably Stone. But I would also say Land of the Headless is a good one as well. And, you know, I just really enjoyed it. And I think this year I'm going to read a lot of the Adam Roberts books I haven't read. I think I've got 6 or 7. So more joy to come. Bye for now.